Welcome to Debt Free in 30, where every week we take 30 minutes and talk to industry experts about debt, money, and personal finance. I'm Doug Hoyes. It's the end of the month, so that means it's time for another frequently asked questions show here on Debt Free in 30. Every day we get lots of phone calls to our 310 Plan helpline, and dozens of people every week email the Hoyes Michaelis team with questions. I keep track of those questions, and we answer the most common questions on our frequently asked questions shows. We get a lot of questions about what will happen to my spouse if I have debts, and what happens to co-signers. So today we're going to answer all of your frequently asked questions about spouses, co-signers, supplementary card holders, and joint debts. Before we get to those questions, let me tell you some facts. If you're a regular listener to this show, you'll know that every 2 years we do a detailed study of everyone who files a bankruptcy or consumer proposal with Hoyes Michaelis. We call it our Joe Debtor Study, and we talked about it back on show number 36, which aired on May the 9th. You can go to joedebtor.ca to read all about it. Here's some interesting facts from that study. Of all the people who go bankrupt or file a consumer proposal, 40% are married or common law, and 28% are separated or divorced. That means that more than 2/3 of everyone we help either has a spouse or did have a spouse, and it's very likely that they had debts together. What do I mean by debts together? To answer that question and lots of other questions about whether or not your spouse is responsible for your debts, I'm joined today by Jason Quinney, a trustee who works in the Hoyes Michaelis offices in Barrie, Vaughan, and our Jane and Finch office in Toronto. Jason, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Good, Doug.
So let's start with that question then. What does it mean to have debts together? So explain that to me.
Well, having debts together, a lot of couples, when they go get loans, they have to get a co-signer. So they co-sign debts together.
So the key point there is we have both signed for the debt.
Yes.
So give me some examples of where people would both be signing for the same debt.
Well, they could go into the bank for a line of credit. Sometimes they need a co-signer, so they both sign together for that line
Why
of credit.
is the bank asking for a co-signer? What's the typical reason that two people would be signing?
Usually it's so they could have two people to collect from.
Okay, so it's the bank wants their butts covered.
Yep.
It's a lot easier to get money from one person or from two people as opposed to one.
Yep.
So a line of credit would be an obvious one. What other types of debts are often joint where two people are signing for them?
Mortgages.
That'd be another common one.
Yep.
where people do that. So what about credit cards? So there are two different ways a credit card can have two people associated with it. You could have a joint credit card, or you could have a supplementary credit card. So let's start with the legal concept. What's the difference between, legally between a joint credit card and a supplementary credit card?
Well, a joint credit card would be a co-sign. So both of you sign for it. Where a supplementary credit card is when you get a credit card and then they ask you if you want another credit card for your spouse.
And that's a pretty common thing.
Yes.
You fill out the form and you've already qualified. So
They always ask you if you want a supplementary one.
you tick the box, boom, there it is. So your spouse, if we want to use that example, and the supplementary card could be for anyone. It could be for your adult child. It could be for your mother, I guess.
Yes.
But let's take the simple scenario of two spouses. So I tick the box and say, yep, I'd like a supplementary card for my wife. Now, she hasn't signed for it.
Yep.
So is she legally responsible if that card doesn't get paid?
Legally, no.
Because she didn't sign for it.
Because she didn't sign for it.
Okay, so let's talk about real life then. Tell me some stories about what happens in real life with supplementary card holders.
Well, in real life, they will go after the second person.
They will go after them. And so what happens? The first person has to go bankrupt, can't pay. Then they start getting the phone calls, the letters, whatever.
To go after the second person.
So how do I know, if I'm listening to this today and I'm going, gee, well, yeah, we're behind on the credit card bill. I wonder if I'm a joint card holder or a supplementary card holder. How can I figure that out?
Well, the easiest way to figure that out would be to look at your credit card statement.
So if both names are on the credit card statement,
then likely
we're both liable for it.
Exactly.
So okay, if we both signed for the debt, we're both liable.
Yep.
And so does that mean I'm 50% liable, my co-signer is 50% liable?
No. A lot of people think that, though. A lot of people think that they would be co-sign for just responsible for half of the debt, but no, they would actually be responsible for the whole amount.
So it's not 50-50, it's 100%, 100%.
Yep.
So if my co-signer, my joint card holder doesn't pay,
Yep.
the bank is coming after me for the whole shot.
Correct.
Okay, so that's a pretty important distinction then. So just to review then, a joint debt is signed by both people.
Yes.
So if you remember signing the loan application form or the credit card application form, you're joint.
Yes.
Pretty much that simple.
Yep.
If you don't remember signing for it, legally, well, maybe you forgot.
Yep.
But legally, if you didn't sign for it, you may not legally be responsible, but practically speaking, okay, well, you've used the card. It's not uncommon. They're coming after you for it. So okay. So in general, is my spouse, somebody I'm married to, automatically responsible for my debts because we're married?
No.
Now, I get people coming into my office all the time saying, well, the credit card company phoned me and my spouse isn't paying, so they said I'm married, I've got to pay. You're saying that's not the case.
Correct.
Why not?
Well, because if you haven't co-signed for it, you're not joint on the debt. They can only go after the one person.
So it all comes down to who signed for it.
Exactly.
It's as simple as that. So if my spouse didn't sign for it, they're not liable.
Yes.
Simple as that.
Yep.
Okay. So let's take this a step further then. Let's say that I'm in deep financial trouble. I decide to go bankrupt.
Okay.
My spouse does not decide to go bankrupt.
Okay.
How does my bankruptcy legally affect my spouse?
Legally, it's not going to affect her at all, as long as the debt's not joint.
If the debts were joint, then
the creditors will go after her. Will go after the spouse
for the full amount.
For the full amount.
So if my spouse, if I'm considering bankruptcy, or I guess a consumer proposal would be exactly the same.
Yep.
And I'm trying to figure out the impact on my spouse, did they co-sign? We keep coming back to that same point.
Yep.
Because it's, like you said earlier, it's a very common misconception that, well, we're married, I guess I'm on the hook for it.
Yep.
We all the money goes into the same bank account, we pay all the debts together. Legally, that's not the case. So, okay, legally, if I go bankrupt, it doesn't impact my spouse. What about in real life?
In real life, it's going to affect, the bankrupt isn't going to be a very good co-signer.
Okay, so...
Right, so if you go out and apply for a loan or a line of credit or a mortgage, it may be difficult.
So my bankruptcy finishes, we go off to the bank to buy a house.
Yep.
The bank's going to say, oh, you were bankrupt last year. Mm-hmm. Much more difficult to get a mortgage.
Exactly.
Obviously.
Generally, they're going to want you to wait 2 years after your bankruptcy's finished
in order to be able to get a decent rate.
Yes.
So my spouse is disadvantaged in a bankruptcy because I'm a lousy co-signer in the future.
Yes.
I guess the flip side of that, though, is I got rid of my debt.
Yep.
So there's pluses and minuses.
Exactly.
I guess you got to look at the big picture. Explain to me in a bankruptcy, and again, we're trying to figure out how a bankruptcy impacts on a spouse. How does surplus income factor into this?
Well, surplus income, in a bankruptcy situation, you have to look at both of the spouse's income. Okay, so that's how, where in a bankruptcy situation, the spouse could be affected.
Okay, so when you go bankrupt, so again, let's take the case of just the husband is going bankrupt, the wife isn't.
Correct. Yep.
Every month, you have to prove what your family income is.
Yes.
How does that work in practice? How do you do that?
Well, we would get the bankrupt to fill out a form, an income and expense statement, and they would send that in with proof of their income.
So they're pay stubs.
Pay stubs or a bank statement.
And so it would be the pay stubs for both the husband and the wife,
Yes.
even though the wife isn't bankrupt.
Yes.
And the more your family makes, the more you have to pay in a bankruptcy.
Exactly.
And we won't go through all the real specific numbers now, but in real general terms, a family of two, so let's say it's just a husband and a wife, they're allowed to make around
$25.62, I think it is now.
So 25, and that's the number for 2015. Yep. So if you're listening to this in the future, the number might be slightly higher. But so they're allowed to make, let's say, around $2,500.
Yep.
If their income is a lot higher than that because the non-bankrupt spouse has income, that potentially means the bankrupt spouse has to pay a little bit more.
Yes.
But they don't have to pay as much as if they were both bankrupt.
No.
So we factor out the non-bankrupt spouses.
Exactly. We use the bankrupt's percentage of the income.
So if the penalty calculated, let's say the family is $2,000 over the limit, if the husband earns all the income and the wife earns nothing, then the husband is paying the penalty on the $2,000.
Exactly. Yep.
And the penalty is
50%.
50%, so $1,000.
Yep.
However, if both spouses have an equal income, then they're $2,000 over the limit. Then how much is the bankrupt husband going to have to pay?
We would take out the 50% of the spouse's income.
Yep.
And then they'd have to pay 50% of that.
So
it'd be $500.
$500.
Yep.
Okay, so the spouse's income does matter in a bankruptcy.
Yep.
But not as much as the income of the bankrupt spouse.
Exactly.
Okay, so I guess the answer to the question then, we're going to take a quick break here and come back, but in a bankruptcy, the non-bankrupt spouse isn't directly affected, but they are indirectly affected because the bankrupt might have to pay more, might have to pay less. It all depends.
Exactly. Yep.
And they won't be a great co-signer in the future. Great. Thanks, Jason. We're going to take a quick break and we're going to come back and answer more questions about joint debts and spouses and how that all works in when you're in financial difficulty. You're listening to Debt Free in 30.
What are the warning signs of debt problems? Where can I find a free online debt options calculator? Where can I get free ebooks and guides? Find all the answers at moneyproblems.ca, the website for Canadians with money problems who want money solutions. Moneyproblems.ca.
You're listening to Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
We're back on Debt Free in 30. I'm Doug Hoyes, and I'm joined today by Jason Quinney, who is a Hoyes Michaelis trustee. He works in our offices in Barrie, Vaughan, and at our Jane and Finch office in the north end of Toronto. Today we're talking about joint debts, spouses, what happens, who's liable for what. And what we talked about in the first segment, Jason, was that what really matters is who signed for it.
Correct.
So if both people sign for it, both people are liable for it.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter if you're married or not when it comes to deciding who's liable for something.
Yep.
It's all who signed for it. That's what matters. That's what matters. So we talked about how a bankruptcy impacts a spouse if I go bankrupt and my spouse doesn't. And Jason, you said legally it has no impact on them, but it could have repercussions down the road if they're, trying to jointly co-sign for a mortgage or something.
Yep.
So does my bankruptcy appear on my spouse's credit report?
No.
So there's no notation whatsoever.
No.
And the only impact then on my spouse's credit would be in the example of a joint debt again.
Correct. Yep.
So if we're both signed on the debt, I don't pay because I went bankrupt. My spouse now is on the hook. So what happens if I go bankrupt and we've got a $5,000 credit card together, and my spouse says, well, okay, I'm not going to go bankrupt for $5,000. If they continue to pay it, will that have any negative impact on their credit report?
No, as long as they continue to pay it.
That's the key.
That's the key. Yep.
So even though I'm bankrupt, that non-bankrupt spouse can keep paying. It's not a big deal.
Yes.
So what about then with? Let's make sure we've clarified that then. So let's say my parents co-signed a loan I got. I go bankrupt. What happens to my parents?
They will go after your parents for the loan.
And so what advice would you give my parents then? What are their choices?
Their choices would be to pay it.
And if they're not able to pay it, then
Well, it depends. I mean, the parents, they could be elderly, so they could be creditor proof, so they may not have to pay it if they don't have any assets.
So just explain, what do you mean by creditor proof? What are you talking about there?
So if somebody's not working, so if somebody's elderly and they're on a pension, they don't have any assets, they could be considered creditor proof or judgment proof, where they can't get, a creditor's not going to be able to sue them and get a judgment against them. So,
and that it's the key is being able to get something from them, I guess.
Yes.
So you can sue anybody for anything.
Yep.
Oh, the sky is blue, I'm going to sue you for it. And
typically judges aren't going to grant a garnishment against somebody's pension.
Well, because, in Ontario, and the rules may be slightly different in other parts of the country, but in Ontario, the Ontario Wages Act is pretty clear.
Yep.
You can only garnish
income.
Yeah, wages.
Wages, yep.
So if you have a pension, then that can't be garnished.
Yep.
The only exception I've seen would be if you haven't paid your taxes Revenue Canada has the ability to withhold some or all of your CPP payments.
Yes.
Because they've already got their finger in that pot. But
Yes.
if you've got a normal company pension, you haven't paid your credit card bill, they aren't going to be able to, under normal circumstances, get a judgment. They can get a judgment, but they won't be able to garnish that. So is there any way for the bank to collect from my elderly parents who co-signed this loan before I went bankrupt? What about what other advice would you give them in terms of, they're still banking at the same bank? Is that potentially a problem?
That could be a problem. If they're still banking at the same bank where the loan is co-signed with, the bank can go into that bank account and take any money that's in there and put it towards that loan.
Without having to go to court?
Without having to go to court.
Because
when you open up a bank account, it says in the small print that if you owe them money, they can technically take the money.
And I guess even if legally they can't, well, it's their computer system.
Yep.
It's not too hard. And so have you actually seen that happen?
Yes.
So if someone is sitting, listening to us today saying, okay, I've got a bunch of debts. I know that one of my debts is co-signed by my parents.
Yep.
What's the thought process then? What kind of advice do you give someone?
I would advise them to open up a new bank account with a different bank, with a different institution.
Gotcha. So, and that way at least they don't have to worry about something coming out of their bank account that they didn't know.
Exactly, yes.
And I guess when I'm talking to someone like that, I say, well, if your number one worry is I want to make sure that my parents are protected, then what you could do, if it's a relatively small debt compared to all your other debts, is you could deal with your parents' debts first. Okay, so fine. I've got this $5,000 joint credit card that they helped me get, 10 years ago, and their name's still on it. So before I go bankrupt, I'm going to help my parents get that paid down or even paid off, which of course means all my other debts are now going to be really old. But at least then they are protected. If they've co-signed for my $50,000 student line of credit, well, I'm not going to be able to pay that off.
Yep.
And I guess in that case, the best advice for the parents would be if they actually do have some income, they do have some assets, they should probably go to the bank, get it switched over entirely into their name,
exactly.
Set up a new loan. Maybe they can get a better interest rate and deal with it that way. So, okay. Can I go bankrupt on my own, or is it a requirement that my spouse has to go bankrupt when I go bankrupt?
No, you can go bankrupt on your own.
And how would I decide whether I go bankrupt on my own or whether I go bankrupt with my spouse?
Well, the main thing is you got to look at the debts. Are they joint debts? Is your spouse co-signed on them? Does she have supplementary cards on them? Or you could have common creditors. Do you both have the same creditors?
And so if we're both on the same debt, that would be more likely that we would both then have to come up with some formal solution.
Yes.
And would it be two separate bankruptcies that we'd be doing, or would we be doing a joint bankruptcy?
No, you could do a joint bankruptcy or a joint consumer proposal.
And that means it's one process covering both of us.
Yes, and it'd likely be cheaper.
And so when you say cheaper, how would it be cheaper? So let's take an example then. So I've got let's take the example of a bankruptcy.
Okay.
I've got some debts. My spouse has some debts. Some of them are together. Some of them are not. Mm-hmm. If we both went bankrupt separately, as opposed to both going with a joint bankruptcy, the cost isn't going to be hugely different, is it?
Not hugely different, but there is a difference because I would have to do two separate files.
Gotcha.
Right, so the two separate files, there'd be costs on those two separate files.
Because typically as a trustee, you're going to say there's a minimum cost.
Yes.
A couple $100 a month or whatever it is. So if you're doing two files, potentially that minimum cost
times
is
two.
Double.
Exactly.
The surplus income that we talked about earlier wouldn't make any difference if it's two separate bankruptcies or one bankruptcy.
No, you're going to end up paying the same amount.
You're paying exactly the same amount
surplus.
then. So I guess if you have joint debts, or if you have some debts together, or if you both have debts, then you want to sit down with a trustee and crunch the numbers.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, should we do the bankruptcy together or should we not? I guess one of the problems with doing a joint bankruptcy is you only get discharged if both of you complete all of your duties.
Yes.
And so what would be a common example of a duty that might not get completed if we did a joint bankruptcy? So I do what I was supposed to do, my joint person doesn't. Mm-hmm. What would be an example of something they wouldn't do? What have you seen in your experience?
I mean, sometimes sometimes people get divorced during the process. So one spouse could take off. Maybe one spouse is sending income and expense statements, the other spouse isn't. Because if they're separated, then they got to send in two.
Gotcha.
Other things, maybe tax information. Maybe one spouse provides their tax information, the other spouse doesn't.
Or attending the counseling.
Attending the counselings, exactly.
So if there's any risk that your spouse isn't going to be able to fulfill all their duties, that might be an option to do two separate bankruptcies as opposed to one. So great. Well, I appreciate that, Jason. We're going to take a break and come back to wrap it up. Thanks for being here today to talk about joint debts. You're listening to Debt Free in 30. We'll be right back.
If debt problems are keeping you up at night, if collection calls leave you afraid to answer the phone, it's time to end the cycle. You can do something about your debt. Call Hoyes Michaelis today at 310-PLAN.
Looking for information on budgeting, debt consolidation, credit counseling, debt management, and debt settlement? For unbiased advice, go to moneyproblems.ca, the website for Canadians with money problems who want money solutions. moneyproblems.ca.
You're listening to Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Welcome back. It's time for the 30-second recap of what we discussed today. On today's show, Jason Quinney explained that just because you're married does not automatically make your spouse liable for your debts, and we discussed the difference between joint and supplementary accounts, and what happens to co-signers in a bankruptcy. That's the 30-second recap of what we discussed today. I know we emphasized it many times during the show, but it's a very common misunderstanding, so I'll say it again. You are only liable for debts you signed for. Just because you're married does not automatically make you liable for your spouse's debts. However, if your spouse has debts, it may indirectly impact you, so it's important to understand all of the implications of joint debt and debt owed by you and your spouse so that you can come up with the best debt management options. That's our show for today. Full show notes are available on our website, including details on joint and co-signed debt. So please go to our website at hoyes.com, that's HOYES.com, for more information. Thanks for listening. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.
Thanks for listening. This was Debt Free in 30.